Good morning, welcome. We will wait 1 more minute to let everyone join in and overcome technical challenges. So, good morning and welcome to our webinar. My name is Jakub Jaraczewski and I am the Senior Research Coordinator at Democracy Reporting International, and I'm happy to welcome you to a conversation about where do we go next with Hungary after the elections in terms of democracy and the rule of law and European values. We are after the election, the dust is settling in. We know the result, and we know that we are about to witness a sea change of politics in Hungary following a victory of Peter Magyar's TISA, achieving constitutional supermajority and winning over Viktor Orban's Fidesz. And now is a moment to sit down with a couple of fantastic Hungarian colleagues and discuss where do we go from here? What is in for the rule of law and democracy in the country? What is next for its relationship with the European Union in the terms of values? What is next for the incoming judgments from European courts and also judgments that are pending to be implemented? We just learned today in the morning that the Court of Justice of the European Union will next week on Tuesday issue a judgment in a landmark case, Commission versus Hungary, concerning anti-LGBT plus legislation, a case of tremendous importance also due to its legal character. It is a case where the European Commission is claiming that Hungary has violated the Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. And for all of us legal geeks in this conversation, it's perhaps important that the Commission is using that article of the treaty as a self-standing grounds for action against Hungary, not linking it to any specific piece of EU law, but instead saying that the Hungarian government has breached human rights, fundamental rights, and is thus liable over it. So we are in a historic moment, and we are joined by fantastic guests. Today, having us with us is Dr. Edith Zgut-Przybylska, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, and also a visiting fellow at the Central European University Democratic Institute in Budapest. Edith is also a fellow of our Reconstitution program, a program under which we are conducting this webinar, which is supported by Stiftung Mercator. Edith has also been working closely with us on several important outputs regarding Hungary, some of which you have already published, and I will soon put in the chat a link to and comparative analysis of party programs in this election, which still might be useful for many of you. And we will be also putting out more of our work together with Edith in the coming weeks. The second our panelist today is Dr. Csaba Győri, Assistant Professor at the Department of Law and Society at the ELTE University, also in Budapest, also a former Reconstitution Program Fellow and member of the Reconstitution Alumni Network Steering Committee. Csaba comes in with his expertise on law and constitutional law with us today. And finally, the third person who will be taking the floor today is none other than Marta Pardavi, co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Marta has been an instrumental person in the Hungarian civil society over the last 16 years of the crisis of rule of law, democracy, and human rights in the country. And she has worked on countless initiatives trying to address this crisis, push back against damage to European Union values, advocate for reform, raise awareness across Europe and the world on the situation in Hungary. So we have three fantastic speakers, and I will be turning over the microphone to them in a moment. Just a few short words of order. We have a webinar chat, and already you can see that we linked our comparative analysis of party programs prepared by Edith there. And we will be taking a question after our speakers have their chance. And please put those questions in the chat or the Q&A function, so we will be able to take a look at those questions and direct them in the right place. And also, this webinar is being recorded and will be available at a later time at our YouTube channel. So, without further ado, that's probably more than enough of a Polish person speaking, and it's a good moment to turn over the microphone to the fantastic Hungarian guest that we have here. Edith, I think I would love to start with you and ask you to take a look at the political science and sociological perspective and walk us through what just happened. How it was possible? Which of your predictions of expectations, which you said working with us, materialized, and which of your expectations were maybe upended or modified? And looking forward to what will be happening now after the election, what do you think will be the biggest challenges for the new government? And how much priority do you expect this government to give to repairing the rule of law and restoring the relations with the European Union? And what do you expect that they will be focusing on? Give us a scoop on what do you think, what comes next?
Thank you, Jakub, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us among the many, many ongoing Hungary-splaining discussions, or as Marta just said this morning, the Magyar-splaining discussion. And given the name of our future Prime Minister, Péter Magyar, it makes complete sense, especially because breaking news, the president of Hungary has just announced a minute ago that he's going to propose him for the next prime minister of Hungary, which is a very interesting, very fast development. So to begin with, about all these complex questions Jakub just asked me, this was a really critical election for Hungary at many levels, which, as he mentioned, led to this quite unexpected way of collapse of this long-standing hybrid regime in Hungary in a very, very difficult, structurally unfair and politically tilted environment. And to start with a personal reflection, because Jakub asked me to, I personally belong to the school of academics who has always argued that it is possible to replace a hybrid regime in elections, to defeat Viktor Orban in elections, because this was hybrid and not a closed dictatorship like Russia or China, where they imprison and kill people on the street. But I think nobody, including myself, saw such an extremely huge supermajority to manifest for TISA. So living for 16 years under the Orban regime, I think made us hard also to believe that, anyone to believe that this is even possible in such a distorted conditions as we learned and documented for years. So to understand how this kind of political startup of TISA could defeat Viktor Orban, I think we'll need to look at different dynamics of regime failure and oppositional innovation. And I'm going to share a couple of factors with you that I think are the most important. They are just some of many of those, and political science and sociology is going to study them in the future for quite some time, I think. So one of them is the breakdown of the Orban era social contract, let's put it this way. This regime has been long operated on this type of deal, that it's been running on informal power and systemic corruption in exchange for a gradual material improvement for the Hungarian citizens. So it looked like this, that Hungarian people knew that this is a corrupt regime and this is also an autocratic regime, but they could still get their fair share for 1.5 decades, almost shorter, as the economy was improving under. So Hungarian felt that the country was technically going to a right direction. At least it was the case in 2018. This was the case in 2022, but not this time. After 2022, the whole socio-economic environment has changed in the country. Stagnation, inflation, declining living standards were becoming more and more prominent, and Hungarian people didn't feel that they're benefiting from the regime anymore. So at the same time, public services was also deteriorating, like healthcare, education, and this was slowly eroding the legitimacy of the Orban regime. Second factor, the Orban government was losing touch with the society. I think there is, so to say, an understanding between the expert community that that this was one of the most important factors, that the regime was pushing a monolithic fear-mongering campaign, blaming Ukraine, the war, and foreign actors for everything. And this war psychosis became absolutely overwhelming for everyone. And at the same time, the polls were showing something different, that the society was less and less interested in this. People were not primarily concerned about the war or migration. Instead, they became more and more anxious about economy, living conditions, corruption, also that Hungary is getting fully isolated in Europe and becoming more and more overtly pro-Russian. This was a huge revelation for, I think, many Hungarians, especially the younger generation that really wants to belong to Europe and not to Russia. And I think Viktor Orban himself was no longer speaking to the real societal concerns after all. And I have to say that it gives me a huge deja vu of the Polish elections in 2023, where PIS, the former government, have been heavily focused on migration, technically copy-pasting Viktor Orban, but at the same time, the Polish voters were completely worried about something else. At least the majority were worried about economy, and that's how PIS lost eventually. Third factor, hubris. This kind of belief of inevitability that we're going to be winning this thing, and that the Orban regime has been making a lot of strategic miscalculations and mistakes during this campaign. So despite these unlimited resources they were working with, the entire state, which merged with Fidesz, the captured media, the unlimited financial power to boost social media before and after that, the captured media, despite that, the regime completely underestimated the challenger Péter Magyar for a very long time. I think this was like obviously lethal political mistakes, that Fidesz failed to respond effectively to Péter Magyar's super efficient counter narratives about this collapsing state, the bad living conditions, housing issues, etc., etc. And they treated him as a joke. They looked down upon him. They even, until this year, they were treating him as an absolutely, like a different kind of player than Viktor Orban. And at the same time, he was a conservative character. He obviously didn't fit this type of propaganda that was pushed by the regime. That they were saying he is leftist, he's a puppet of Ferenc Gyurcsány, the former corrupt prime minister who is deeply being hated in Hungary, and that he's a puppet of Ukraine. So there was a huge gap, Mariana, trench between reality and what was going on. And super probably that's why Viktor Orban also didn't change the electoral system, as many of us were expecting, because the electoral system was one designed by Fidesz to benefit the largest party, which was Fidesz for 16 years. But now that there was an even larger party, like in reality that they didn't take seriously for quite some time, TISA, this whole monstrous electoral system has turned against its own creators at the end of the day, and started to benefit the opposition after all, which means that Fidesz effectively believed its own propaganda too. So they were completely convinced that they were leading comfortably in the polls, or at least that's how it seemed, and they thought that they will be able to at least catch up in the last minute with mobilization. So they were reinforcing their own war psychosis in-house as well. And eventually it resulted that even their own voters, the Fidesz voters, which is still quite significant, around 2.2 million people, they were completely shocked on Sunday by this defeat, because their own people were just realizing that let's name it, their own leader was lying to them, both about their chances of winning and about the challenger himself, Péter Magyar. And soon people are going to start realizing that the new government is not going to take Hungarians to die in Ukraine to start with. This was one of the narratives they were pushing. Another factor which is also very important is the very emergence of TISA as a fundamentally innovative political force, without which it wouldn't have been possible. The party was combining this kind of charismatic leadership style of Péter Magyar with a strongly bottom-up social movement style, with the TISA islands all around the country, building a bottom-up. And in contrast to the previous opposition, which completely discredited itself, within the society, TISA was using a more holistic, different approach. Peter Magyar went local, went face-to-face to meet with the people, to break through the propaganda bubble, the social media bubble, to directly engage with the citizens by focusing on real everyday problems of the people rather than, abstract ideology or other things. So he was not really slowing down to the propaganda of the government, I would put it this way. And this is how TISA could successfully unify the fragmented opposition voters behind themselves. And this is strictly linked to my next point, which is the innovation itself of this party/movement. So it was very good at offline participation and engaging, but also with digital mobilization. This was also key. And these TISA islands that I just mentioned, these were these participatory platforms engaging citizens, and they were also restoring a sense of political efficacy, so that people felt that finally it makes sense to do politics, to engage and to do something, because there is going to be an impact, and it really matters. It's not just something which looks good on social media in artificial bubbles. So this strong social media mobilization, I think it was especially among the youth, that was very effective. I think youth was one of the biggest question mark also for us academics and those who were doing the polls, because everybody knew that the youth is leaning towards TISA. The TISA is extremely popular, and then Fidesz technically lost an entire generation because they do not have a tangible offer for the youth. But nobody knows exactly how many of the youth and how will they actually vote. I mean, if they even gonna go and vote, and they did. And I think that TISA could very successfully transform this protest energy, this frustration of the youth and the generational discontent into legal votes, because they could mobilize them with pro-European messaging and also anti-Kremlin messaging. So Jakub mentioned this extremely good vibes and party vibes of Budapest from Sunday, and the common chanting that all the youth was doing while they were jumping on the streets and on the bridges was that Russians go home, Russians go home. This is like the hashtag that everybody was using. And my very last point, and I'm going to stop here, is so to say the last coffin, like last nail in the coffin, was the elite fragmentation of Fidesz, because as this momentum grew that I was just describing here, all of it led to this so-called like bandwagon effect, that in increasing perception that TISA could actually win this thing. This was triggered further elite defection. We have seen more and more whistleblowers, people from police, military, state institutions to step forward, brave people who stepped out and started to tell by risking their own existential kind of standards and everything, and losing their jobs, starting to tell the story how deeply the system is corrupt, how the system is turning towards their own Hungarian citizens, how they're trying to destroy democracy, or they already did, by using state resources, like secret services against Hungarians. So this was also crucial, and it became obvious that the regime's internal cohesion began to crack. So this was, I think, the very last kind of nail in the coffin. And to wrap it up, I think if we want to take a lesson learned from all of it, and there will be many more since, is that hope eventually replaced fear after 16 years. And once voters started to believe that change was possible, the regime's key control mechanism, fear and dependency structures, they started to weaken and crack at a very high speed. And at the end, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy that resulted in the highest ever participation in elections in Hungarian history, and it led to the collapse of the Orban regime by Sunday. So I think these are the factors that explain that even within a very tilted playing political field, it still become possible that the system is vulnerable at the end of the day, because ultimately this is how it falls, how elite cohesion is cracking, and when there is a capable and innovative opposition that can provide a real offer to the people that resonates not only their hopes, but also their real anxieties, and can engage them in a meaningful way, just like TISA did, it is possible to oust autocratic leaders and hybrid regimes from power. I will stop here, thank you, and probably get back to the rest of the questions in the second round.
Thank you very much, Edith, for this. That was fantastic at many levels. And one thing which you mentioned struck me in particular was the emotions and what was happening among the crowds on the ground. And looking and comparing at what were the scenes from Budapest on Sunday and compared to the Polish elections in 2023, this was a big difference in just how much popular emotion, people chanting and being happy and partying after the vote in Hungary compared to a much muted, let's say, celebrations in Poland 2 years ago. Maybe there is something that our sociologist friends can dig into more. But for now, let's move to law. Kszaba, I want you, if you could go all-out constitutional lawyer on this and tell us what are the implications of the supermajority that TISA won. Can the new government undo anything that has been established over the last 16 years, or are there some entrenched elements that will be difficult to adjust or to remove? Especially in terms of key institutions, for example, the courts, the Curia and the Constitutional Court. What can the new government do? Can they reshape those institutions, change their leaderships, or perhaps is that not possible? And for your assessment, what do you think that should be the priorities of constitutional reform? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I would like to structure my answer a bit and start with what the government can do now and end up with what, if there is a new constitution, how that should be, a new constitutional order, how that should look like. So the chief the brief answer to the first question, what the government can do, are there any legal constraints? The brief answer is in domestic law there isn't much, but there are possible constraints in EU law and on the European Convention of Human Rights. So Hungary's legal system requires a two-thirds majority to change the constitution or amend the constitution. This is given. And another characteristic of the Hungarian regime or the legal regime, not the Orbán regime, the constitutional system, is that we have quite a large number of so-called cardinal laws, which also require a two-thirds majority to change, but this is also given. And the strategy of Fidesz was in the last 16 years is this to entrench the sort of constitutional foundations, the constitutional footing or legal footing of the political system that it that it has built in these cardinal laws, in the expectation, and in the constitution, in the expectation that even if they lose power, the incoming government will not have a two-thirds majority. But this is clearly not the case. So in that sense, there are not many legal constraints. There are political costs and political risks, but no legal constraints. And I give you an example which was being widely discussed in how that would work. Probably is easier than some abstract theorizing. How this could work. So, for example, one of the big issues also with the European Union is the so-called KEKOAs, which is the Public Interest Asset Management Foundation, which are public foundations, and the logic here is that the government sort of assigns a public function to these to perform a public function to these foundations, and then it generates a legal duty to provide assets or funds to discharge those public functions. And these are the sort of universities that are maintained by foundations. The universities that do not receive EU funding because of this. I think most of the listeners know the story. And there are a range of other more obscure formations. The biggest of which is the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, MTC. So one group of these are just having these public functions and giving, from the annual budget, receiving funds from the state to discharge of public functions. And there are a smaller group, which is the Corvinus University, the Semmelweis University, and the Matthias Corvinus Foundation, where was an actual asset transfer from the state in forms of stake in government, previously government-owned stakes in Hungarian companies, Richter Gedeon, which is a pharmaceutical company, and MOL, which is an oil company, and essentially an endowment to these foundations. And these are entrenched. And before the election, when all this thinking was going on, how you can take it back without a two-third majority, you can't really take it back. With a two-third majority, you can simply take back the public function essentially to the state, and that sort of dissolves the duty to finance any of these things. And even with the asset transfer, I think there are legal ways to say that because these foundational the laws on this foundation says that even if the assets are renationalized, this can only happen in exchange for consideration. But you can simply change the constitution, the due process clause of the constitution, and say nationalization or the legal requirement to provide an immediate and full compensation in the case of nationalization doesn't apply when a state asset was transferred for free. So this is an example that how you can undo something that was meant to be entrenched. When it comes to power structures or individuals that are entrenched in their positions, they can also be removed theoretically by constitutional changes or changes to cardinal laws. It is including the president of the Curia or the president of the Constitutional Court and others who the Magyar Péter, the prime minister, the future prime minister, actually listed many of them, calling them to resign. This included the president of the Curia, the president of the National Office of the Judiciary, the president of the Constitutional Court, remarkably not all the judges, but just the president, the chief prosecutor, and heads of the media authority. So these can be removed by changing the law that applying to how they can be removed. And the constitution. There might be political cost with that, but I guess we can discuss it later. And it looks like the government is willing to take that political risk that is coming with it. But there are legal constraints in the EU law, especially the Article 19 of the Treaty of European Union and Article 47 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which would apply to likely would apply to the removal of at least the president of the Curia, András Varga Zsé. And I would like to note here that the ongoing case of Parliament versus the Commission, the Advocate General explicitly noted in her opinion that the removal of the president of the court is not what the EU law demands, and it doesn't follow from EU law. That would be actually, I don't remember the exact language, but she basically intimated that this is not what the Commission demands or the EU law demands, and as a matter of fact, would be against it. So this would be a legal risk in front of the European Court of Justice to remove the president of the Constitutional Court, which is also an EU court under the European Court of Justice decision about the Constitutional Tribunal, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal. So this is I think it's a legal constraint that is probably the hardest, and that would make it difficult to deal with the resistance from the Constitutional Court. I don't think that broad judicial reforms are necessary immediately. In Hungary, the Constitutional Court is fully captured, so that would be a problem for the new government. and removing them is removing the judges. I think they would run against EU law. But the government is willing to take that political risk or the legal risk. What an effect of that is further down the line, I'm not sure. There are ways to go around it short term, but they're not necessarily elegant ones. And that would include basically changing and amending the constitution in the same way that Fidesz did it several times by basically elevating provisions that would otherwise belong to parliamentary acts into the constitution to preempt the constitutional review. This is possible. Fidesz did it multiple times. I'm not saying that all the constitutional amendments they might make is not legitimate or not warranted. For example, if you want to give prosecutorial powers to this anti-corruption authority that the government is planning to form, that would require a change in the constitution. I think there would be a legitimate constitutional amendment if they're going along with that. But many others would be the same kind of not elegant measures to preempt the constitutional review. But every the Constitutional Court. How the Constitutional Court will behave, it's really hard to say. It also depends on how the president will behave, whether the president will be sending draft laws or parliamentary acts left and right to the Constitutional Court for the constitutional review. We don't know. I can imagine that this would also be shaping the response of the government to this problem. Finally, there is also, I think, the most prominent call to resign was to the president. Here you can also change the constitution. I'm not an EU lawyer, but I don't think there is an EU requirement that protects the president as opposed to judges. This is also, I think, it's a political risk, a political decision that is probably made. It seems to be made. So to sum it up, I don't think there are any really hard domestic constraints neither in the constitution nor in the cardinal laws. There's some ways that you can go about this is not elegant. It would probably run against the sort of same rule of law principles that we have been talking about for a long time. And that in itself entails a political risk. But there are some hard constraints in EU law. But I think all of that should be, these are short-term problems, short-term or medium-term problems, if the new government really goes on and creates a new constitution, and which they made noises about. It's not. I don't think there's a full commitment, but it really sounded like they want to do that. And that would throw up a different question. Also in terms of the EU law constraints that I'm talking about, because if there is a new constitution and there is a vote on the constitution in the population, so there's put up for a vote among a formal referendum. Then the question is kind of reformed, or reform can be reformulated. I don't think EU law has the tools for that, even the theoretical tools. What if the constituent powers decision is in conflict with EU law? If you remove the president and remove the court's president and even the constitutional court judges in creating a new constitution that has genuine democratic legitimacy by the constituent power. So that is a question for the future. As to how the new constitutional system should look like, I think the most important question is how to prevent this kind of entrenchment and making the democratic correction of any governmental decision or any decision on parliamentary majority possible. And this is a very difficult question. In Hungarian constitution is very easy to change in international comparison, especially in connection with the electoral system. That, as you can see, is basically now 5 elections in a row created a two-third majority and a constitutional majority, which is, I think, highly unusual, and it's not a good thing overall. So I think one of the I don't think there's any sort of need to change the constitutional system of Hungary in any way. The biggest question is, I think, how the electoral system would look like and how the constitutional amendment, the system of constitutional amendments, how the constitution will regulate its own amendments to prevent that kind of entrenchment that we are now given opportunity to get rid of. But should be able to prevent them reforming again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaba. And you must have some psychic powers because you did answer at least one question which was asked in the meantime in the chat, but I will return to it later, so to also give the others. And from your intervention, one comparison which obviously jumps forward is again the situation in Poland and the fact that for the Hungarian parliamentary majority, the sky is wide open in terms of possibility of reform with this majority. For the Polish ruling coalition with a unfriendly president and with lacking the amount of votes to defeat a presidential veto, let alone reform the Polish constitution, which is much more difficult to change. That's an entirely different story. But now we go to our third panelist, Marta. From your perspective as a human rights defender, how does it feel to see this change? How does it feel after all those years of your work? And particularly moving into the substance, which areas of human rights and the rule of law you would want the new government to focus on first? Which judgments from the European courts, both existing judgments, we have, for example, the outstanding judgment on asylum law, which has not been implemented, and the Hungarian government keeps being penalized by the European Commission over this, on which incoming judgments you would want to see implemented as a priority. And also from your perspective as a civil society representative, how do you see the collaboration between the new government and NGOs and think tanks, and what do you think could improve in this field?
Thank you very much, Jakub, and greetings from everybody in the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. So you asked me, how does it feel to witness and experience this change? I think I really have to point out that indeed the emotional component, the positive energy that is unleashed, is really important. It was very palpable on Sunday evening in the streets. Nothing like this has happened, I think, in Hungary before, at least not I would remember it. Really an extraordinary relief, joy, happiness, and people partying and dancing and hugging each other, complete strangers, you know, basically crying, tears of joy together, and also shouting every now and then, 2/3, or Europe, Europa. So this was, I think, a very tangible moment of not only joy about change of the political leadership, but also an expression of hope that we will have a different style of government with a very clear expression of the value sets too, so that, you know, Hungarians really, I think at the end of the campaign, which was excruciating and really testing, but felt that it's not only about the pocketbooks, but also about whether it's going to be the Russians in or the Russians out, and us in Europe or we're out of Europe. So this is in this sense a really a cathartic moment. And for those of us who have lived through this and worked through this 16 years, I think, you know, I'm thinking not only of independent civil society, organizations like Helsinki and my colleagues, but also the judges who, despite, clear pressures, continued to stand up, or the journalists who were not only denied access to information, but it turns out that they had been also, surveilled with spyware and intimidated in so many ways. So for all these people who did such a, sometimes I might have seen to others, a hopeless cause, we always had, I think, a very strong sense of commitment. But anyway, this moment promises us a new era, new opportunities, but also very clearly new tasks and responsibilities. But it is a breath of fresh air, sort of a burden lifting, and finally an opportunity to do the work we've always wanted to do rather than the work we were tasked with, which was this political propagandistic project. I also see signs of a new energized public, and I hope this will be sustained, this energy, this commitment to not only the values, but the interest in engaging with politics. These mornings when I walk to the office, I again hear people on the street talking about the latest news and saying things like constitutionalism and rule of law. It's quite amazing. And I hope that civil society will have, and also the media, but also the political leadership will have the good sense to sustain this. And so in a sort of a summary, we've been nurturing something, and in microscopic form, we've seen how this resilience exists, and now it can be scaled up, and it was scaled up. And so, what we will do now, well, first of all, we'll continue to do what we've always done. This is no way, sort of making us question whether our tasks will be fundamentally different, but it will be different in terms of not focusing on resistance, but perhaps in this coming period, we will be able to shift towards a sustained oversight, engagement, accountability. So this can mean also formal organizations, but also citizens and policy institutes. So, a broader group of engaged citizens can take part. I'm also quite conscious of the challenge, though, between our level of ambition and also that of the government and the level of available resources. So, who is going to be there to make sure that not only government is capable, but that civil society can continue to engage with this energized and clearly, in terms of their value-based, very pro-European electorate. So you asked also what should be the first steps to take. I mean, there's a very long list, and Csaba, Edith have already highlighted a number, but I think clearly the government said we need to do everything to gain access to the frozen EU funds, and this is a major project. It will require a very rapid legislative initiatives. The Hungarian parliament, we do not know when it can start its work, but the expectation is around the end of May, early June. So we are looking at extremely strong sort of head start. This will also mean a lot of work for us. So I would imagine, numerous legislative initiatives, and they would need to go through not only Parliament, but also the various other actors in the constitutional framework. Csaba addressed this, the head of state and the constitutional court are certainly actors to watch, and what happens to them and how they act, whether they all of a sudden find the powers that they have refrained from using to stall or prevent or put up obstacles, or whether there will be, adaptation strategies, as also in the public administration. It's a big question. But certainly before the constitutional changes, I would look at, how these actors will actually act in practice. What we also want to see, but this was something Péter Magyar has been saying in the past weeks and also these days, dismantling the Sovereignty Protection Office. Let's just get it over with fast. Remove the restrictive legislation that has been both a threat and a real nuisance to civil society work. So this would mean also not only undoing legislation, but also I think a pretty different style of open government where there is an emphasis from political leadership on the legitimate and useful and valuable role of citizens and their groups in taking part in our common issues. So politically legitimate, not partisan, but politically legitimate and welcome contribution from citizens and civil society. And these practical, the practical expression of this would be to actually adhere to the existing law and legislation, which has a proper process for citizen consultation. And I would want to see a human rights committee in the Hungarian parliament to which we could go to. I've been at the Helsinki committee for so long. I remember going to the parliamentary human rights committee, but most of my colleagues don't even recall having one. So, this will open up an engagement opportunities which we would want to see strengthened for civil society. I want to see opportunities for us to take part in the policy and the legislative, conceptualizing process. We talk about potentially a new constitution. I mean, imagine the workload, but also the commitment and the interest that this will bring, not only within Hungary, but also in circles like the one we have here now. So to go on, yes, we would want to see clear reinforcement, freedom of assembly, doing away with the so labeled child protection law, but actually it's just a huge restriction on the dignity and the freedom of expression of Hungarians and members of our society. I think there should be a clear focus on the media, and Péter Magyar just went to his first interviews in the state broadcaster. He made it very clear that they're going to suspend the news media, the news service of the public broadcaster until it has been revamped. And he was very clear about this. This is something to work on, both by also defunding the propaganda machinery, the distortion of public government ad spending, the distortion of state aid, in fact, is going to, I think, hopefully tilt back the balance to better coverage. But there's a lot of issues that also will need to engage European legislation. So the European Media Freedom Act, for example, the DSA authority. So this is why perhaps Magyar spoke about the need for the Hungarian Info Communications Authority to also resign, the media authority. Yes, there's institutional straitjackets for academia, and Csaba, you gave a very, very important example of these public interest asset management foundations, the one that I think particularly the Matthias Corvinus Collegium will be maybe a key focus here, but there's others, and we need Hungarians to go and participate in European initiatives, research and academic exchange, Erasmus Horizon. So the return to Europe, I think, will be a key issue. And these institutional straitjackets need to be dismantled. Now, which judgments? I mean, Hungary, as the DRI EIN publications have shown, has been really bad at implementing human rights and EU court judgments. So there's a long list on how on what to work on. Just some I would highlight from the ECHR. Sabo and Vichy, unchecked state surveillance. It really came out not only in Pegasus, but now against the TISA party. So how easy it is to surveil in a formally lawful manner. This has to change. Freedom of expression of judges, the famous Baka judgment will be also, I think, in the focus. And then a last one, the Kennedy versus Hungary, enforcement of freedom of information judgments. This will be important, particularly when we talk about ensuring that there's no entrenchment. There's something, there's a lot of things from Luxembourg. I'm now sitting in the Central European University's building because our office has moved, but I'm very conscious that there's no students around. So, some of these judgments might never actually be fully implemented because it would require such a operational change in the reality of institutions that it's no longer affordable. But still, there's quite a lot in the field of asylum, Everybody knows about the 1 million euro fine that Hungary is paying. It's a real financial burden, and it's a real rule of law obstacle. So I think the implementation of Court of Justice judgments cannot be politically selective. This is something I think that we will have to look into in the field of migration and asylum. The rule of law and the migration policies, as stated by Peter Magyar, might be a terrain for clash. But I want to bring here something that has been perhaps less talked about, but we see it as a potential minefield. Over time, we've seen how the Hungarian Curia has become a battleground for political pressure. And Csaba has already talked about Curia President András Varga as a key actor in this. He's also been called on to resign. Something that is more than just the president himself is the set of administrative and internal regulations that the president can deploy to actually block not only judicial independence, but the effect of European Union law. And this is something which we see as a real hard case, because what I'd like to address is really geeky for lawyers, but it's also very important that the Curia is now applying a new tool, which is called the uniformity complaint system, to block the direct effect of EU law. In 2020, this new uniformity complaint system was introduced and consolidated in the further years. And this means that there's uniformity decisions that are delivered by the Curia. They're meant to safeguard the uniformity of jurisprudence. And these are sort of binding internal rules, almost like quasi-laws within the judiciary. They apply within the judiciary to judges and courts subordinated to the Curia, and they function as another further supplementary set of internal laws, rules. So judges will make preliminary references to the Court of Justice to ask how EU law should be interpreted, particularly when they see a clash between Hungarian law and EU law. And this has been, I think, a very important rule and opportunity to safeguard some fundamental rights and rule of law standards in Europe, and particularly also in Hungary. And so we have seen how these uniformity complaint proceedings have become basically a system to block the direct effect of EU law. Already cases have been going forward where we have seen a clash between what the Court of Justice has said in its in the ruling that responds to a preliminary reference request, and how the Curia has proceeded. So what has happened is that if there's a new interpretation of EU law coming from the Court of Justice, that is basically a response to the Hungarian judge's question, if this conflicts with the interpretation of the same rule, the EU law that has been adopted by the Curia in a uniformity decision, the individual judge cannot set aside the apex court's interpretation, but rather has to follow a new process. So basically request the Curia to cancel the binding force of its previous uniformity decision. So the hand of the Hungarian judge, having received the interpretation of the Court of Justice, is basically tied. They have to ask the Curia to change their own previous position. And this is a part of the strong formal and informal powers that are held by the Curia president, who András Varga has expressed, repeatedly, his view that the emergence of a conflict between Hungarian constitutional identity and the supremacy of EU law is inevitable. So this could be a further pushback in a very legalistic but also very fundamental way against EU law if, for example, decisions and taken by the future government calling referencing EU law standards to basically override perhaps previous jurisprudence or Hungarian constitutional existing standards will be rolled out, this could be a way to test and also push back. So this also has to be undone. This uniformity complaint system is going to be potentially an important tool to undo, but also it could be used, abused, exploited to block really the progress. So, and also this will point to perhaps a larger question where Hungarian courts, captured as they are, could be using the idea of constitutional identity and the protection of our constitutional values, also Christian culture, to push back against implementing EU law. This is one of those areas which are technical and seem legalistic, but will be, foundational. Your last question, how we would like to collaborate. Well, so we really are welcoming the ambition to go back to a system that relies and sees rule of law and democracy as its pillars. So we think this is a great opportunity. We want to take part in rebuilding a democratic, pluralistic constitutional order. Obviously, this is in every citizen's interest. But we know that this is, more than just an institutional redesign question, and it's more than formal structures. It's about a public ethos, And I think this is what was expressed in Hungarians' fatigue with the Orbán system. So we want fairness, we want transparency, accountability. When citizens chant, down with the corruption, this is what they're asking for. So this is a very important moment for us, and we would want to not only follow these legal developments, but also we would want to put forward concrete proposals, and we would like to be heard as part of a wide range of actors along with academics. So this is a really important moment, I think, for academics to also step forward and assist in a way that complies with EU values and rule of law and serves the interests of Hungarian society at large. And this is where we are at this moment, and we'll see how this offer of constructive but independent, autonomous engagement will be taken up by this new government. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this rolls out in practice. Thanks.
Thank you, Marta. You speaking made me realize one thing, which is obvious for everybody probably in Hungary, but I was completely unaware that the Human Rights Committee at the Parliament was not functioning. Even during the peacetime, the Committee for Human Rights at the Parliament was still existing, and opposition politicians could voice there, and you could engage with this. And what emerges for me from your presentation in particular is the question of priorities and what to do with the resources that the new government will have and what to put first as one of the challenge. So now, thank you very much, dear panelists, and we are moving to the Q&A session. And I have a personal reflection because I've been on this rodeo for quite some time, and I've moderated more than a few webinars, and I've never seen so many questions in the Q&A. I think it speaks to the timeliness of this conversation. It speaks to the quality of our speakers, but it also speaks to the interest of our fantastic audience who have come up with some really fantastic and great questions. And apologize if we will be not able to answer all of them on the time. We will try to do our best to fit as many as we can. So please, dear panelists, if I may ask to be as concise with your answers as possible so we can fit as many of those great questions. And I will start with the first one, which Ksaba has already answered, but I would like to hear also from Edith first and then Marta. What reforms should be enacted in Hungary to shield the country so that no party, including TISA, or any other in the future, would be able to abuse the power and to reshape the country the way Fidesz has done? Edith, what would be your take on this?
That's a good one. Thank you. We've been my other great fellow speakers have been talking and elaborating a lot about potential change of the constitution and what policy implications that might mean for the country. And I think one of the most important is that at least the future government started to say the right things about power constraints. So we've heard about term limits introducing for the prime minister for 2 years. I think this is crucial in terms of not seeing what we've been witnessing in the last 16 years of one figurehead, a chief patron, centralizing power all over the years, all over again. And it will eventually also might have a serious political implication for the future of Viktor Orban as well, on the other side right now, and his political future, which might eventually lead to the Jaroslav Kaczynskiation of his political future, that shall Fidesz get back to power according to the constitution, if they won't be able to change it, he might need to be, if he still wants to be on board, pull the strings from the back, because he won't be able to become prime minister for the next time, as he's been already having it for 5 times. So that's I think one thing. The other thing I think it's even more important is that super probably, to avoid what we have been witnessing in the last 16 years, is that we have to move beyond institutional changes only. So it's going to take probably a generation to change not only the institutional design, which might take quite short time, as Csaba and Marta was alluding to, but also to change the mindset and the political culture of the country. And what I'm meaning by here is that democratic instauration has to also focus on societal and normative transformation, which is about not only to reduce hyperpolarization, which I think is also very crucial in terms of our hugely distorted political culture, but also to introduce mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. These are informal democratic norms, which are prerequisites for a functioning, healthy democracy. And it means, in a very short explanation, is that no matter how big power you have, no matter how much space you have to maneuver, you're not going to change and push things, and not going to butcher the institutions so that it's going to benefit for you to stay in power forever, no matter what. So I think these are super probably those that we should certainly look at. And what I see is that in this work, which is going to, as I said, take more time than just 2 weeks of quick restoration, is going to need a very active engagement of civil society, as Marta has been talking about. And I think, just cycling back to Poland and how important it is to have people engaged in a very bottom-up kind of fashion, is that how successfully, for instance, locally active civil society organizations have been cooperating with local governments for even after the hardest period of PIS ruling, where there was a strong intention to re-centralize things and to demolish local autonomies. So I think that's a very good example to look at. And I see where this is how the TISA Islands could have a very important role in the long run, so that this type of bottom-up engagement and engaging civil society and increasing efficacy could hopefully lead to this kind of a long-term engagement of not only organized and formal civil society, but also the people, so that they were going to have this maintained efficacy, that it makes sense to participate, to deliberate, to want to sit at the table where the decisions are being made. And of course, cycling back to the top-down design, what I hope that this new government is really truly going to fulfill as a promise in their party program is exactly decentralization, to give local autonomies powers back to the local governments, and to restore what I think was, both from the perspective of Hungary and Poland, a very important kind of goal at the democratic transition, that it's going to be a decentralized design with very strong local autonomies. Then, and we also know it from political science and sociology literature, these are absolutely fundamental prerequisites against centralizing power in the long run.
Thank you, Edith. Marta, what's your take on this?
So I think this is a very, so a lot of this questions will revolve around people. And not only in terms of the role that civil society can play, which I would like to really, bring up and up and up again in every fora, but also on how people in institutions themselves are Hungarian citizens who might have felt very oppressed. So I know that for a lot of people working in the public sector, this is at a moment where they also sigh, have a big sigh of relief. Without disclosing too much, I know that we might have opportunities to, for example, do joint work with some law enforcement institutions in terms of training and human rights compliance efforts. And this is the way to build back. So I think this will be a key moment for people to start thinking about how to engage in a different way. I fear sometimes that that we have lost, the muscle to cooperate and to work with institutions also. So this is when I said, we would want to move from resistance to responsibility and accountability. I would love it if my organization could go back to working with, for example, the border police, which is now the part of the police, but it's, has a distinct role. Or if we could work together with the migration office, if we could work together with the regular police on hate crime prevention, not only in a sort of in a fashion where we can never meet, but we recognize that others have a valuable professional take, but in a regular official cooperation for methods. I think this could be a real game changer on the ground and sustain the democratic inclination or ambition. But I have to say that this is going to be also maybe a moment, and many civil society organizations are conscious of this, where government will need good people. And we've seen this at least in Central Europe, in many countries, that there was an opening and a change of the individuals who serve the public in the state structures. And so people will have a calling perhaps to work in the public sector, and this might leave the civil society in a completely different place. So I'm looking forward to seeing how these trends will develop, but I know that this will be both a return to perhaps pre-2010 practices, but also an opportunity to learn from what didn't work so well then. For example, it's not a top priority for most people in Hungary or the government, but for civil society, this will be, I think, a key issue. How will public funding work? Will it continue on a politicized basis? Will there be a new way to do it in a fair, a transparent, sort of equitable way? Will there be new structures put in place to have a more enabling civil society environment? Will there be not only the willingness to discuss and to enter into dialogue, but to actually support the causes of democracy and human rights in Hungary, something that there hasn't been any public funding, any public engagement for decades. So these are also things that I think are on the mind of many civil society organizations. I'm curious to see how, for example, the Civilizatio Coalition, which has been very, very useful and essential in coordinating the pushback against civic space restrictions, will change its work perhaps and will be able to focus on a more positive agenda, which was already laid down in a document that we have adopted last November, where we laid out the policy suggestions and priorities that would be necessary to bring back a healthier civic space.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just
yes,
to
sure.
chip in here for a moment and
Of course.
ruin this optimism here. I think there is that what most people, foreigners, I think misunderstand sometimes is that, for example, the politicization of the criminal justice, especially the prosecution service, was not primarily entrenched in law. Yes, they were tinkering with the criminal procedure, but it is institutional. That has been around for a long time. There is the Soviet model of the prosecution service, which is extremely hierarchical, almost militaristic hierarchy. The judicial deference to prosecutions in trial, which is also not entrenched in law. So what I'm trying to say with this is that the danger remains that the sort of the institutional receptiveness to authoritarian modes of governments, which are not necessarily entrenched in law, it's just institutional or organizational practices, will be is a huge temptation to utilize them because the changes will be more effective if they happen, and that is a huge long-term problem, I think, for our country, because we always had this sort of duality between, you know, very sophisticated bureaucracy, sophisticated legal training on one side, on the other hand, you know, long traditions of the rule of law that going back to the Austrian monarchy and before that. But then you have this kind of entrenched, cognitively entrenched modes of authoritarian governance. They're not going away now. And it will be very tempting for the new government to use them. And I think that will be hard to distinguish what is sort of a necessary, you know, what necessary correction, and the joy about the efficiency of the change, and this sort of entrenched receptiveness for it. So I think that will be a tough choice for us as academics, but also for NGOs like Marta, where you draw the line there. So this will remain. This will be invisible. This will actually make it look and more efficient and good, but this is a constant danger in Hungary, which a government with this kind of authority that this new government is going to have will be inevitably tempted to use.
Thank you, Csaba. And I see Marta has a hand raised as an advocate to this. If you could very briefly.
Yeah, so I totally agree with this. The cultural traditions take forever to change, but they can be supported both from, you know, bottom-up initiatives. So if you let police officers meet civil society and think together about, you know, how they can do their job better so that they are better appreciated, provide a better service, in fact, that is one avenue. And I know that there are many who want to cooperate and do their job better, but haven't been allowed. And they thirst for an opportunity to go into their workplace with less political pressure, still with the pressure of everything else that comes with working in that institution. On the other hand, what we do not have to address these systemic challenges, which are both cultural and also somehow politically exploitable, are the technical support programs that countries outside the EU still might have. So this will be, you know, so in a little bit, Hungary is going back to perhaps a space, and I'm sure Poland and Polish colleagues will recognize that might be a little bit reminiscent of the pre-accession moment, where you have to build and fortify. But do we have the major structural support mechanisms, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of technical assistance that the EU has offered or still offers? So these don't exist. And so we might see, you know, this is for grand EU policy making considerations, but we might see, again, not only the inability to recognize and respond to rule of law erosion, but not so much in terms of the toolkit to support this quite important and optimally rapid building back. Because who's going to, you know, run the training programs? Who's going to run the constitutional, whatever concept hubs and labs that we would need to make sure that this process doesn't really reverse in a few years? And that goes across the board, not only for Hungary.
Thank you very much. And the next question I will direct to Edith, because it is about the TISA program and what in the selection appealed to the younger people, to the young generation, and how would you kind of describe how did young people vote and react, and whether this was a desire of an entire generation which did not know any other prime minister of Viktor Orban in their lives? How do you assess the role of the young vote in this election?
Thanks. I was happy to see this question because I think it raises many other important questions about this election. One of them is certainly for social scientists, including myself, to probably rethink our preliminary, elaborated ideas about the youth. And how exactly they're going to participate in politics in general. And I think it was very for many of us, very pleasing things to see that in contrast to Poland, where the support of the far right within the youth, the extreme right, like Konfederacja and everything to the right of Konfederacja is extremely high. We see something different in Hungary because the youth was, of course, it's not a homogeneous bloc, so there are others who would, of course, go for our homeland, Mi Hazánk, but majority has been lining up behind TISA. And this specific question was leaning towards the party program, so that what could have been the thing that was attracting them. And I would mention two things. I think was speaking well to the youth was this kind of overall markedly different approach towards market economy and a significantly new relationship with Europe, not only in general, but also because it have very important policy implications for Hungary. And this top priority has been mentioned many times during this conversation, how important it is to restore access to EU funds, that this is going to be the prerequisite for everything in the country, including, fulfilling the campaign promises of TISA, for instance, making living standards of the people better so that they can feel that the country is finally heading the right direction. I think what spoke directly to the grievances of the youth was housing, so that it's a huge issue of the youth because they have no chance to start their own life with, and investing into healthcare, which is, often on a level of a third world country. So that these are the specific, so to say, sectoral things that the youth was very concerned about. Decentralizing education as well, which could make it competitive within the European Union, restoring access to Erasmus, and Horizon grants, etc., in the long run. So these are all things that resonate well with the younger generation, and most importantly, require a lot of money because the budget is empty, as we know it, due to 16 years of systemic corruption and mismanagement of the of the economy, resulted in a quite literally empty budget. So as I said, prerequisite of everything, kickstarting the economy and starting to govern the way how they promise to govern in terms of economy and public services, pretty much hinges to that. The other thing that I wanted to mention is about this other priority to hold corrupt criminal Fidesz government accountable. I think this is also something which splashes nicely within the youth, who have been recognizing how corrupt the regime is, so that the new government was promising to establish this so-called Asset Recovery and Protection Authority. Of course, a lot of things will depend on enforcement. This is going to be key, and it remains to be seen whether it's going to truly deliver some transitional justice, which Hungarian society have never had over the course of 30-something years of post-communist history of Hungary. I mean, literally, not even the previous Orbán government, who was in 2010, won the elections on a strongly anti-corruption ticket, they also didn't touch this issue. So I think there has been this kind of cumulated effect of huge sentiments from the society to see that something is finally going to be done with this. So we're going to look into these kind of structures of informal power and corruption, which prevailed in the last 16 years, and to figure out how to, identify and investigate this kind of regally claim assets that believed to have been illicitly acquired from the public funds. That's, I think, also something which is probably something that is highly liked by the youth. But these are only a couple of those.
Thank you very much. For the next, I think I would just bundle a group of questions because, unsurprisingly, we have a lot of questions about comparisons between Hungary and Poland. And so I would form this question for the rule of law restoration process, which Hungary will be now ahead. What's different from the situation in Poland, and how would you, which actions that have been already conducted in Poland you would think could work in Hungary, and what should be done different? Marta, maybe starting with you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jakub, I was busy answering Erika Schlager's question. So can you just repeat?
Yes. So what's the differences between the situation with the rule of law restoration in Poland and Hungary, and which actions which the Polish government has taken so far you believe could work in Hungary, or what should be done different?
Well, the big difference is that I think the capture of the economy wasn't so profound in Poland. And so this goes far beyond the rule of law related focus. Obviously, not only has it taken a longer time in Hungary, but also has had a pretty different aim, maybe. If I can put it so bluntly, the primary aim was not, as far as I understand, in Poland, was not to grow a very close circle of patronage, very rich, but rather it was more a political or ideological slanted project. Not saying that there is no corruption and those who perpetrated it are here somewhere in Budapest at the moment. So I think that's a significant focus difference, and I think this will mean that there will be a huge pressure on the government to address this, and it will be the ways to address this will of course end up having a very important rule of law slant. But I think this is quite a big deal and harder not to crack. The difference also will be, I think, perhaps manifested in the way that this problem should be approached, because it would require, I think, a pretty complex set of people to sit around a table or several tables to think about it. Just this public interest asset management foundations, one thing, but also Transparency International Hungary has highlighted in quite a lot of studies details about the entire capture of the private sector and how wealth accumulated through possibly criminal means, and also from the by creating legalistic or legal conveyor belts between the public funds to private pockets, have ended up creating very intricate legal trusts, private equity trusts. And so this is going to be, at the end of the day, a big question about the right to private property and how restrictions on interfering with the right to private property will be looked at. I think this is a new dimension, and it will have a big Strasbourg angle maybe, but also could have of course a Court of Justice angle. So this is going to be a holiday or a feast for lawyers for many years. But of course, the basic question will be if we're able to do a relatively good enough job in stopping corruption and putting some public money back into the public pocket, will we be able to craft better policies from these resources? So it's not only the money that is missing and that has been stolen, but I think the underinvestment in public services. And this is what voters really are fed up with. So they want good healthcare, they want good teachers, they want good public safety, they want higher wages, and all this fits into one big mess that has to be untangled.
Thank you. And now, Edith, your take on this.
Thank you. I just very briefly wanted to join Marta in her argument and also to back her up in the kind of systemic differences. And she's right by saying that one of the most important difference between what happened in Poland and in Hungary is that in Hungary, we haven't been witnessing the complete political monopolization, both the state and the economy itself, because this was the case in Hungary, this kind of dual distortion from in a very top-down kind of centralized manner. It is also that speaks to to my book that I published recently about informal power in Hungary and Poland, and how much the problem went much deeper in Hungary in terms of this kind of much more informal side of the problem, which goes beyond the legalistic, formalistic ways of how we try to understand democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland. And there has been very many important interpretation from the legalistic point of view. But I think there are some great legal scholars, even like András Jakab and others, who would argue that after a point, it was just simply not possible to understand what exactly was going on with the distortion of democracy from a legalistic point of view. So we had to go beyond and look into the informal side of the problems. And Marta is right. This is not something which is going to go anywhere. This is like a polyp, as it was designed and conceptualized by Bálint Magyar, which is going to be much more difficult to deconstruct in a way, in a sense that while, for instance, these platforms, as me and Marta also mentioned, about reclaiming public assets, super probably will be possible to a certain extent, but it's not necessarily meaning that all the stolen public assets will be able to be reclaimed by this new government. And as we know it, in Poland, the situation was nearly not close to this. So it was rather focusing on the rule of law, also capturing of the state itself, meaning the state institutions and how they have been used and abused, but not the way how we've seen it in Hungary, the way how I just explained.
Thank you very much. And Csaba, over to you.
Yes. So I would really second what Marta and Edith said about a crucial difference between Hungary and Poland is the lack of this sort of this kind of ground corruption or state capture that you had in Hungary. I live in Poland, as you know, as many of you know. I've been living there for 10 years. It is incomparable, even during the peace government. It wasn't, there's not non-existent. And when it started with Orlen and all those things at the end of the peace power, that was amateurish and you know, small scale compared to what the Orban system did in Hungary. And I think it's what I would like to press here, and I think I didn't talk about it. We always talk about lawyers and talk about constitution making, and some of the questions are about that. What we shouldn't forget, and I think that's very important, is that you know, the material conditions of constitutionalism. Because I think that is what really would the success of this project would depend on. Whether the government, the new government, can build a functioning states and functioning public services, and it's a huge task. And only in those conditions, I think we'll have members of the political community that would really willing to engage in a new discourse on the constitution. It wouldn't be just us talking about it, but actual people. So that is I think is very important with this kind of legalistic liberal discourse omits quite often that you have material conditions here that I think the success depends on. And going back to the Hungarian Polish, and it, you know, it is part of this kind of transfer of the public assets. It would be very important element of this. And what I was talking about, I think it's very easy to crawl back these sort of foundations. It is much harder, and Marta is right, with these totally intransparent investment funds, which hold enormous amounts of wealth to control the economy or certain parts of the economy in Hungary. Now I'm a bit more optimistic because some of these people wants to do business, and I think they have to accommodate the new government. I don't expect Mészáros Lőrinc and these kind of figures who clearly couldn't survive in a market environment survive this financially. Others, I think, much more willing to align. And that would give some room for the government to crawl back, even in these sort of offshore funds that we don't know where the money is and who actually owned it. So there will be limited ways to crawl that back, but I don't think there will be not everything. And then finally, the one of the ones which is going back to the law, which is, I think, as I said, I think it is less relevant actually, but the parallels between Hungary and Poland, I think when it comes to the judicial reform, we have two questions about this, so that's why I want to answer that. I think the situation is easier Hungary and harder at the same time. It is easier because our government has a two-third majority, can change any laws it wants. including the constitution. It's harder because it's also less messier than the Polish situation is. We don't have judgments from the European Court of Justice against the government or against judicial reforms. So you don't have a sort of the European law lag that the Polish system could use to resist is not existent in Hungary, meaning in terms of judgments. We didn't have our constitutional court, while it was captured, didn't sort of self-immolate in the same way that the Polish Constitutional Tribunal did, sort of arguing itself into irrelevance. So that makes it harder. At the same time, and given that, I don't think there is much that we can learn from the Polish government. It's very context dependent, and is no offense to our good friend Adam Bodnar, but the Polish strategy, would seem to be to wait for the presidential elections, which didn't work out. So not much happened anyway in Poland, and in Hungary they can do, as I said in my initial contribution. I think they can. There's not much constraints in the domestic law, with some constraints in EU law, but I don't think that is really comparable.
Thank you very much, all of you. And with a bleeding heart, because I have still multiple fantastic questions in the chat, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So I would definitely encourage those with those questions to get in touch with our fantastic expert directly and to seek their wisdom on topics such as the role of the European Union or the more nitty-gritty legal finesse of the situation. But unfortunately, we have to slowly draw to the close. And thank you all very much. This is not the last what you've been hearing from the Reconstitution Project on the rule of law in Hungary. Tomorrow, there will be an event in Budapest, an all-day academic workshop to discuss the legal aspect of this election, to unpack it. So if you happen to be around, please feel free to join. You will also be hearing more from us at Democracy Reporting International, as we will be working with Edith on the rule of law recovery map and a roadmap on how to proceed next in order to address all those burning issues and balance the various priorities, which I think was very clear from our event. There is a lot to do, and there is only limited amount of resources, and there are a lot of pressures, including the European Union, from the European Court of Human Rights, to get on with the most critical issues. And it will be interesting to see what the Magyar's government will prioritize. Once again, this recording of the event will be soon available on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to watch it. And please follow us and follow our fantastic experts for more on the rule of law in Hungary as we emerge, hopefully, from a crisis and we move into an equally challenging and difficult phase of recovery. Thank you all very much and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, and greetings to everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Bye.
for coming.